Today, we need to talk about something that is happening right now, in real time, right under our noses, and nobody in the mainstream media is connecting the dots. So just imagine this with me. Imagine an entire empire, a regional superpower that has spent the last 40 years funding insurgencies, terrorizing shipping lanes, and holding the global economy hostage, collapsing. But not from a barrage of missiles, not from a massive trillion-dollar ground invasion, not from boots on the ground. Imagine them collapsing because their bank accounts were simply turned off. Right now, an invisible war is being waged, and the United States is quietly orchestrating the greatest geopolitical masterstroke of the 21st century. And here is the number that nobody wants to say out loud. Here is the number buried so deep in the financial data that you'd need a forensic accountant to find it. But it explains absolutely everything happening in the Middle East right now. 500 million. $500 million. That is exactly how much money Iran is bleeding, not per year, not per month, every single day. By the end of this video, you are going to see exactly what is happening behind the curtain. You're going to understand how a specific, ruthless strategy of total economic strangulation by the new Trump administration is doing more damage than 1,000 aircraft carriers ever could. But it doesn't stop there, because when Iran falls, the dominoes start tipping. We are talking about the complete and total fracture of the OPEC cartel. We are talking about the strategic paralysis of China. We are talking about the utter financial ruin of Russia. And, perhaps most embarrassingly, the total exposure of our European allies as fundamentally weak. This isn't just a foreign policy shift. This is a complete rewiring of the global world order, and the ripple effects are coming straight to your wallet. So hit that subscribe button, pull up a chair, and pay close attention, because this story, it goes incredibly deep. Let's get into it. Let's set the scene with what is actually happening in the Persian Gulf right now. For decades, Iran has operated on a very simple, very brutal business model. They pump oil, they sell it on the black and gray markets, and they take those billions of dollars and funnel them directly into a proxy terror network. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. For years, the world treated this as a military problem. We sent billion-dollar destroyers to swat down $10,000 drones. We played whack-a-mole with terror cells. But the current administration looked at that equation and realized something fundamental. You don't defeat a parasite by fighting its tentacles. You defeat a parasite by starving the host. And right now, Iran is starving. The strategy is total, unyielding economic annihilation. The United States has systematically choked off the shadow fleets. The secondary sanctions are so tightly enforced that nobody, not even the most risk-tolerant rogue traders, wants to touch Iranian crude. And remember that number I gave you at the beginning, $500 million a day in lost revenue? Think about the math on that. In a single week, that's $3.5 billion vanishing into thin air. Iran is weeks, literally weeks, away from exhausting its physical oil storage capacity. Their tankers are floating aimlessly in the ocean, full of crude oil that nobody will buy, acting as giant, useless metal paperweights. Economically, the regime is crippled. They are effectively neutralized. Now let's talk about who actually gets hurt by this, because it's not just the Ayatollahs sitting in Tehran. Imagine you are a Houthi militant commander in Yemen. For years, the cash just flowed. You bought weapons, you paid your fighters, you disrupted global shipping. But suddenly the courier doesn't show up. The bank transfer doesn't clear. The paychecks bounce. What happens to a mercenary army when the checks stop clearing? They fold. Iran can no longer afford to subsidize its proxy terror network. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. They are all looking at empty bank accounts. The battlefield has permanently shifted. This is no longer a kinetic military problem. requiring American troops to dodge mortar fire in the desert. This is an endgame of absolute political surrender, driven by bankruptcy. The engine of Middle Eastern terror has simply run out of gas. But here is where the story gets massive, because you cannot rip a hole that big in the global oil market without taking down the entire architecture of global energy. And that brings us to OPEC. For half a century, OPEC has been the untouchable cartel. They control the supply, they manipulate the price, and they hold the Western world hostage whenever it suits them. You pay more at the pump because a room full of oil ministers in Vienna decided you should. But Iran's economic death spiral is creating a panic. The cartel is currently on the absolute brink of dissolution. Why? Because the fear is contagious. Nations like the United Arab Emirates and Oman are looking at the writing on the wall. They see the U.S. aggressively dominating the energy space and enforcing its will, and they are signaling a potential exit from the OPEC alliance. They realize that playing games with artificial quotas is a losing bet. When the cartel fractures, and it is fracturing as we speak, those artificial quotas evaporate. It becomes a free-for-all. Every nation will start pumping at maximum capacity to secure whatever market share they can get before the bottom falls out. And when they do, global oil prices are going to plummet. We are talking about a catastrophic crash in the crude oil market. Now think about the geopolitical leverage that goes away when oil is dirt cheap and plentiful. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been the ultimate choke point. Don't make us mad or we'll close the strait and oil will hit $200 a barrel. That was the threat, that was the leverage. But when the world is flooded with crude and the U.S. is dominating domestic production, who cares about the Strait of Hormuz? It is completely stripped of its geopolitical power. The weaponization of oil, a tactic used to bully the West since the 1970s, is being disarmed in real time. Now, you might be asking, what does China think about all of this? If you want to know what total strategic deterrence looks like, look at Beijing right now. For years, Xi Jinping has been playing a very patient, very expensive game of chess. He has poured massive, multi-decade strategic investments into rogue states to secure resources and build a coalition against the West. He threw billions into Iran. He threw billions into Venezuela. And almost overnight, the United States has turned those investments to ash. The money China poured into Iran evaporated. The leverage they thought they bought, gone. But the real story is Taiwan. China has been watching the United States systematically dismantle an entire regional power without firing a massive traditional invasion force. They are watching the U.S. and its allies demonstrate the overwhelming, terrifying capability to flood a combat zone with advanced drone networks, precision missile tech, and integrated naval swarms. Imagine being a Chinese military planner right now. You are looking at the blueprints for a kinetic invasion of Taiwan. You are looking at the logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of troops across the Taiwan Strait. And then you look at what the U.S. just did to Iran's economy and military infrastructure, using nothing but economic chokeholds and advanced swarm deterrence. You tear those blueprints up. Beijing is deeply, fundamentally deterred. They realize that if they make a move on Taiwan, the United States won't just fight them on the beaches. They will turn the financial and technological screws so hard that the Chinese economy, which is already teetering on the edge of a massive real estate and demographic crisis, will completely implode. We have effectively paralyzed the dragon without starting World War III. And if China is paralyzed, Russia is absolutely drowning. Let's follow the money to Moscow. Vladimir Putin's entire war machine in Ukraine, the tanks, the artillery, the endless waves of conscripts, is funded by one thing and one thing only: inflated oil prices. Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. Right now, they are enjoying a temporary financial buffer. Because of the geopolitical tension, Oil prices have been just high enough to keep the Russian economy on life support. But remember what we just talked about. Remember the collapse of OPEC. Remember the impending tidal wave of cheap oil about to flood the global market. When that oil market crash hits, it is going to financially devastate Russia. It is going to be the final nail in the coffin for an economy that is already bleeding out in the Ukrainian quagmire. You cannot fund a 21st century war when your primary export is suddenly worth half of what it was a year ago. The math simply does not work. The Kremlin will be forced to make impossible choices. Do they pay the pensions of their citizens, or do they build more artillery shells? Furthermore, because of the total dismantling of Iran, Russia has been functionally excised from the Middle East. They relied on Iran for cheap drones. They relied on Iran to cause chaos and distract the West. With Iran neutralized, Moscow is totally isolated. They have no allies left who can actually afford to help them. They are trapped in a war of attrition they can no longer afford to finance. The bear is broke. Which brings us to the part of the story that is honestly the most infuriating, but also the most revealing. We need to talk about Europe. For years, European leaders have lectured the United States. They've stood behind podiums in Brussels and Paris and Berlin, talking about diplomatic nuance and criticizing American assertiveness. But what happened when the chips were actually down? What happened during this global crisis when the U.S. needed cooperation? Total hypocrisy and capitulation. When the U.S. moved to systematically dismantle the Iranian threat, a threat, by the way, that funds terrorism right on Europe's doorstep, what did our European allies do? They denied the United States crucial airspace. They restricted base access. They were exposed as fundamentally weak, paralyzed by their own domestic political constituencies. They are terrified of protests in their capitals, so they bow to the pressure, completely abandoning the strategic alliance. But here is the sick irony of it all. Europe is entirely dependent on the very American military freelancing they criticize. They refuse to fund their own militaries to NATO standards. They rely on the United States to secure the shipping lanes that deliver their goods. They rely on American hegemony to keep Russia from rolling across the Polish border. They are an all-talk ally. They want the security umbrella of the American empire, but they refuse to hold the umbrella when it starts raining. The events of the last few months have permanently shattered the illusion of European strength. The world now sees them for what they are, spectators in a global arena where the United States is doing the actual heavy lifting. So let's bring this full circle. Let's bring this right back to your front door. Because all of these global maneuvers, the collapse of Iran, the fracturing of OPEC, the deterrence of China, the ruin of Russia, the exposure of Europe, what does it actually mean for you? It means you are about to witness a domestic economic boom unlike anything we have seen in decades. This isn't just foreign policy. This is a massive domestic political masterstroke. Think about the convergence of these events. As OPEC collapses and the world pumps oil, what happens to the price of gas? It crashes. Imagine going to the pump and paying a fraction of what you paid 2 years ago. When energy costs plummet, the cost of manufacturing drops. The cost of transporting groceries drops. Inflation, which has been crushing the American middle class, gets a stake driven right through its heart. Combine that crashing oil price with a sweeping agenda of domestic deregulation. American businesses are suddenly unchained. The cost of doing business plummets while the purchasing power of the American consumer skyrockets. And politically, this is happening right ahead of the midterm elections. The administration is going to point to the map and say, look at what we did. We neutralized the historic threats in the Middle East. We bankrupted the terror proxies. We deterred China without shedding American blood. We crippled the Russian war machine, and we brought gas prices down to historic lows. It is a narrative of absolute, unquestionable American hegemony. It is framed as a triumph that no prior administration, Democrat or Republican, could ever achieve. We are stepping into an era where the United States isn't just leading from behind, it is aggressively dictating the terms of reality to the rest of the world. So here is the bottom line. You are watching history being rewritten. We started with an invisible war. $500 million a day drained from a terror state. That single thread, once pulled, unraveled the OPEC cartel, broke the Russian war chest, stopped the Chinese military complex dead in its tracks, and exposed the weakness of Europe. And the result? Unprecedented American dominance and an economic revival that is going to change the trajectory of this country for the next 50 years. Drop your thoughts down in the comments below, because these conversations are exactly how we stay ahead of the curve. If this video opened your eyes to the real geopolitical chessboard, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that actually dictate your future. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking questions. I'll see you in the next one.